the cold, unyielding barrel of a Glock pressed hard against my temple. Patricia Blackwell, the HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper through clenched teeth. "Get off our private road, or I'll make you regret it," she hissed, the sunlight glinting menacingly off the gun's polished surface. I froze. Everything stopped. My breath, my thoughts, even the distant chirp of birds seemed to vanish. In that instant, I understood that this confrontation wasn't about community rules or neighborhood standards. Patricia didn't care about property codes or landscaping violations. She wanted my land, and she was willing to kill for it. Who would have imagined that a bitter HOA president, my ornery but loyal donkey Clyde, and a muddy patch of Texas dirt would become the heart of a battle for truth and justice? If you're watching this, leave a comment, because this story is bigger than me. I never imagined that leaving behind the high-tech life of Silicon Valley would land me in the middle of corruption, intimidation, and outright threats. But here I am. And let me tell you, if you mess with a software engineer who knows how to rig a GPS tracker and train a stubborn donkey for sabotage, you'd better be ready for what happens next. My name is Mason Cooper. I'm 40 years old, and after spending over a decade buried in the fast-paced, burnout-inducing world of tech, 15 years of debugging code until my vision blurred, I decided I'd had enough. I cashed out some stock options and traded my sleek apartment for a piece of land I could actually touch. A modest 5-acre ranch nestled just outside Willow Creek Estates, Texas. My dream? Simple. Live off the land, raise some animals, grow my own food, and still work part-time in software, but on my terms. I wanted peace. I wanted simplicity. What I got was a war. Willow Creek Estates looked like paradise, rustic, charming, peaceful. A place where sprawling oak trees shaded the land, and a gentle creek curved right through my property. But underneath that postcard exterior lay a twisted undercurrent. The community was an odd blend of faded farmlands and fresh luxury builds, old barns standing beside manicured lawns and golf carts. I should have been more cautious when the realtor casually mentioned unique community standards, but I was too taken with the land to read between the lines or the fine print. The ranch house was worn, but solid. A little rough around the edges, but nothing a bit of elbow grease couldn't fix. There was even a weathered barn, just waiting to be filled with life again. And best of all, the price was right. It sat on the edge of the neighborhood, accessed by a dirt road that, according to every survey and deed I checked, was mine. My road, my land. Within weeks of moving in, I threw myself into transforming the property. I built chicken coops, started a vegetable garden, brought in a few goats, and adopted Clyde, a donkey with more attitude than any animal I'd ever met. Smart, stubborn, and fiercely territorial, Clyde quickly became both a companion and a security system. His usefulness became clear one day when a stranger's ATV crossed onto our land while I was at the hardware store. By the time I got home, the vehicle was abandoned, and its brake lines were mysteriously shredded. Security footage showed Clyde, ears back, defending our land like a four-legged soldier. I was impressed, and maybe a little concerned. Homesteading became my obsession. My mornings started before sunrise. I'd feed the animals, tend the garden, then clock into remote work from my laptop until mid-afternoon. Then I'd swap the keyboard for a shovel, or fencing tools, or seed packets. My hands toughened, my back ached in ways it never had before, but I felt alive. Eating vegetables I'd grown myself, gathering fresh eggs, watching the sunset from a creaky porch swing, it was everything Silicon Valley had never been. At first, the neighbors seemed friendly enough. Mrs. Johnson brought over homemade sourdough. Old Man Wilkins waved from his tractor and gave advice about crops. Even Patricia Blackwell greeted me with what I mistook for a genuine smile and handed me a massive welcome packet detailing HOA regulations. I should have known from the sheer size of that binder, 3 inches thick, that trouble was looming. 3 months in, that trouble arrived. It was a hot Saturday afternoon when I spotted them, 3 people standing in the middle of my access road, blocking it with their ATVs. As I got closer, I recognized Patricia with her signature sunglasses and designer blouse, flanked by Nancy Roberts, the HOA secretary, clipboard in hand like it was glued there, and Greg Wilson, the treasurer, sweating in a full business suit in 90-degree heat. I rolled down my window. "Afternoon, folks. Mind if I get through to my home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Patricia stepped forward, lips curled in a smirk. Mr. Cooper, this is HOA property. You're in violation of at least 7 community standards, she said, gesturing vaguely toward my land. We're reasserting access control until compliance is met. I blinked. This is my driveway. On my property. I've got the deed, the surveys. You can't just. That's when she pulled the Glock from her designer handbag and pointed it straight at me. I have a concealed carry permit, Mr. Cooper, she said, calm as ever. And you're trespassing. My heart pounded. I slowly shifted the truck into reverse and backed away, knowing full well that this wasn't just an HOA squabble anymore. This was a threat, a criminal one. But my gut told me going straight to the police wouldn't be enough. These people had friends in high places. I needed proof. That night, after finding a long detour through a neighbor's field, thankfully with their permission, I sat at my computer and started digging. Land use laws, HOA loopholes, enforcement procedures. I researched for hours. The dirt road was mine, no question. The HOA was twisting vague language in an outdated land covenant. And worse, I discovered Patricia had been trying to pressure property owners on the community's edges to sell. Why? Because there were quiet whispers of a luxury resort and golf course in development. My little homestead was in the way, but I had an ace up my sleeve. During our standoff, while she was ranting and waving her gun, I had slipped a GPS tracker onto Patricia's ATV. And now, watching the tiny blinking dot on my screen, I smiled. Two can play this game, Patricia, I whispered. Beside me, Clyde let out a snort and stomped a hoof, as if giving his approval. I scratched his ears, glanced out at the pig pen placed precisely near a bend in the access road, and started sketching plans in my notebook. The next morning, my wife Emma arrived from San Francisco. She had just finished closing her chapter at a big corporate law firm and was ready to start our new life together. When I told her what happened, her eyes went wide. That's aggravated assault, Mason, she said firmly. We're pressing charges. She was already reaching for her phone to call the sheriff, but I gently took her hand and stopped her. Wait, I said quietly. This goes deeper than HOA rules. Patricia's connected to developers, maybe even to local politicians. If we go to the cops now, we'll lose the element of surprise. But if we're smart, if we gather evidence, we can expose all of it. She stared at me for a moment, then slowly nodded. And just like that, the fight truly began. We agreed to gather more evidence before making our next move. Emma looked skeptical, her brows furrowed with concern, but she eventually nodded. As a seasoned corporate attorney, she understood better than most the importance of building a rock-solid case before striking. Fine, she said, her voice low and firm. But the moment someone points a gun at you again, all bets are off. There was no room for argument in her tone. That same afternoon, we paid a visit to our neighbor, Dave Anderson, a third-generation farmer whose family had been absorbed, almost against their will, into the ever-expanding borders of Willow Creek Estates. Dave was in his early 40s, with weathered skin and hands rough from decades of labor, each callous a testament to his resilience. He stood on his creaking front porch and greeted us with a weary nod, offering tall glasses of sweet tea. Been wondering when you'd come by, he said, glancing past us toward the winding road. Saw Patricia and her crew blocking your driveway yesterday. That woman's on a mission, and it's not a good one. Dave spoke candidly, his voice lined with bitterness. He explained how the HOA had been systematically squeezing out the original residents, working-class families and local farmers, people whose properties didn't fit Patricia's pristine vision of an upscale, sterile community. My sister lost her land after her divorce, he told us, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Patricia caught wind of her financial troubles, pressured the mortgage bank behind closed doors, and scooped up 10 acres for pennies. I've seen her do it at least 6 times. His voice faltered, then hardened. She doesn't negotiate. She eliminates. The golden afternoon sun cast long, solemn shadows across Dave's porch as he recounted the history of his family's land. The Andersons had owned their 100-acre farm since the 1920s, growing cotton in the early years before branching into peaches and pecans. But in the early 2000s, developers began snapping up surrounding parcels, seducing landowners with promises and pushing others out through intimidation. Eventually, Willow Creek Estates took form. The Andersons resisted the HOA's jurisdiction at every turn, But through what Dave believed were backdoor deals and a few conveniently timed zoning changes, they were forcibly brought under its thumb. They fined my daddy $750 just because our tractor was visible from the road, he said bitterly. Then hit us with another grand for the chicken coop. Said the red paint didn't match the approved palette. They want us gone. It's just a matter of time. Emma, never one to let injustice slide, started asking pointed legal questions about the HOA's charter, its authority, and whether any of the incorporation methods could be challenged. Dave disappeared inside and came back moments later with a dusty, weather-worn cardboard box. He set it between us with a thud. Been collecting this stuff for years. Meeting minutes, budgets, emails, not that it's done me any good. Maybe you too will have better luck. That night, after a quiet dinner made from vegetables grown in our own garden, Emma and I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, land surveys, HOA bylaws, property records. Her eyes scanned a document, her finger pausing on a series of questionable amendments to the HOA charter. These weren't properly ratified, she muttered. They expanded the HOA's power without a valid vote. She flipped through another file, then stopped cold, holding up a property map where several newly acquired lots had been highlighted. Look at this. Every property they've taken forms a perfect outline. It's not random. It's the footprint of a future golf course. And probably a resort. The next morning, we received a formal violation notice. This time, it accused us of unauthorized agricultural activities and using non-compliant livestock paint colors. The fine? $2,000, with daily penalties if not paid. That same afternoon, I overheard two women whispering in the local grocery store aisle. I heard they're keeping dangerous animals, one muttered. Patricia says they could contaminate the water table, the other replied. The smear campaign had begun. In response, I installed security cameras, some hidden in trees, others disguised in birdhouses. Within days, the footage began rolling in. Patricia, Nancy, and occasionally Greg trespassed while we were away, snapping photos, jotting notes, and in one chilling video, opening our chicken coop to peer inside. But the worst came later. The camera near the creek caught Patricia walking with a man in an expensive suit. He unfurled a set of architectural plans and pointed at our land. Once we acquire this parcel, we'll reroute the creek here, he said. Patricia didn't even blink. Don't worry about Cooper, she replied. He'll be gone within 2 months. Emma's legal training kicked into high gear. She filed requests for official HOA records, demanding transparency. Nancy reluctantly handed over a few documents, conveniently claiming others had been lost. But what we did receive revealed a pattern: targeted fines, mysterious meetings, and a slow, deliberate plan to push out anyone who wouldn't sell. We also discovered Patricia had a sealed financial fraud conviction from before she was HOA president, information carefully scrubbed from her public persona. That night, as we sat down for another home-cooked meal, a new violation notice arrived. This one for offensive cooking odors crossing property lines. We laughed, but beneath our amusement was exhaustion. The pressure was relentless. As we stood at the sink washing dishes, I glanced at Emma. Do you ever wonder if we made a mistake coming here? She paused, elbow deep in soap suds. Sometimes, she said. But then I think, if people like Patricia can bully us into silence, they'll do it to anyone. Someone has to draw the line. Just then, a gentle knock at the door broke our quiet. I opened it to find an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, nervously glancing behind them before stepping inside. We can't stay long, Mr. Fitzgerald whispered. But we want you to know, you're not alone. Half this community is scared of Patricia, but a lot of us are watching. And we don't like what she's doing. His wife nodded. Last year, she made the Hendersons tear down their son's wheelchair ramp. Said it didn't fit the community's aesthetic. Their boy lost both legs in Afghanistan. They left quietly, too frightened to stay longer, but their visit lit a fire in me. Patricia had created an army of silent enemies. It was time to give them a voice. For the next week, I tracked Patricia's Saturday inspection route via a hidden GPS device. Like clockwork, she rode her ATV through the neighborhood, crossing our disputed access road each time. That's when my plan took shape. I began training Clyde, our strong, stubborn mule, to respond to audio cues, teaching him to pull heavy loads using a custom-built harness and hook system I'd been tinkering with for weeks. As I sketched out the details at the table one night, Clyde gnawed on a rusted brake line beside me, as if sensing the coming storm. "It's time," I said to Emma, watching her eyes light up with resolve. "Let's give our HOA friends the welcome they deserve." I needed to truly understand who I was dealing with, what kind of influence she had in the community, and how deep her connections ran. This meant broadening my investigation beyond the usual scope of the HOA's structure and bylaws. One morning, purely by chance, I ran into Sheriff Tom Collins at the local diner. He was a tall man in his 60s, with a weathered face that told stories of decades in law enforcement, and a pair of sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. I struck up a casual conversation, starting with property rights, something safe, and then gradually pivoted toward more sensitive topics like gun safety laws and trespassing regulations. He raised an eyebrow at my line of questioning. "Interesting questions for a newcomer," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Any particular reason you're asking?" I kept my tone light, explained that I'd had some disagreements with the HOA. Nothing serious, just differences of opinion, but I made sure to keep it vague. At the mention of Patricia, however, his demeanor shifted. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, and his eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Blackwell and I," he said slowly, "have differing opinions on how community rules should be enforced." He was choosing his words carefully, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. After a pause, he reached into his jacket and handed me a card. "If you ever have a situation that requires law enforcement, call my office directly." Scrawled across the back in blue ink was his personal number. As I left the diner, I had the distinct feeling that I'd found a potential ally. One who was cautious, yes, but not blind to what was going on. Still, it was clear he would need hard evidence before making a move. Later that week, I met with Emily Taylor, a journalist for the local paper. I reached out under the pretense of helping her with an article on rural community development, but my real aim was to feel her out. During our meeting, I casually brought up concerns about transparency in modern HOAs. Her eyes lit up immediately. "I've been trying to dig into Willow Creek's HOA finances for months," she admitted. "There are whispers about connections between your HOA, Mayor Harris, and Pinnacle Development Corporation, but so far, no one's been able to prove anything." We agreed to stay in touch, to share information and keep each other informed. I could tell she had a fire in her belly, the kind that makes good reporters dangerous to people like Patricia. But the pressure was ramping up. Suddenly, our water, sourced from a shared community well, slowed to a trickle. The HOA, as if on cue, retained a law firm specializing in property disputes. Soon after, letters started arriving at our door, threatening, accusatory, and increasingly hostile. According to them, we were in violation of numerous rules, some of which were so obscure or outright fictional that it was clear intimidation was their primary tactic. Then came the most outrageous move yet. Patricia managed to convince the town to install a temporary road barrier at the entrance to our property, claiming it was a public safety concern. Until the inspection was completed, we were essentially landlocked. The legal letters escalated daily. The latest one demanded an absurdly specific payment, $5, $723.42 in fines, with a threat of property liens if not paid within 30 days. Emma, who had experience in law, meticulously reviewed the documents. Her verdict was sharp and immediate. "They're bluffing. Half of these so-called violations reference rules that don't exist or don't apply to your property type. They're using legal noise to scare you into compliance." The reduced water pressure forced us to get creative. We installed emergency rain collection systems, another so-called violation, and began hauling drinking water from town in 5-gallon jugs. It was exhausting, but it only strengthened our resolve. Ironically, the HOA's harassment was making us more self-sufficient, not less. Through our security system, Emma and I began to track unusual activity. One day, we watched Patricia walking the property line with Brian Foster, a former military security expert now working for Pinnacle Development. He was taking notes, photographs, and measurements while Patricia gestured toward different areas. We couldn't hear the conversation, but their body language suggested planning, serious planning. When I brought this to Sheriff Collins, he was sympathetic but cautious. "Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, I can't intervene. HOA overreach isn't the same as a crime. These people know the limits of the law and how to push right up against them." His deputy, Linda Martinez, however, took a more direct approach. One evening, She showed up under the guise of investigating a noise complaint. Once inside, she dropped her professional demeanor and spoke in hushed tones. "Patricia's tight with Mayor Harris," she whispered. "But the county commissioner? He can't stand her. Document everything. And I mean everything. Timestamps, GPS coordinates, videos. If you ever catch them damaging your property, that's when we can act." She glanced nervously out the window. "Be careful. People who've crossed Patricia have had pets go missing, cars vandalized. Nothing ever traceable, of course." Meanwhile, Emma uncovered a massive oversight in the HOA's legal filings. The amendment they used to claim jurisdiction over our unpaved access road. It had never been properly filed with the county. Legally speaking, the road was ours, no question. That discovery was a ray of hope, but we knew it wouldn't stop the harassment overnight. Legal battles like this take time, months, or even years. And in the meantime, Patricia would continue to turn the screws. Then, unexpectedly, small signs of support began to emerge. A note slipped to me by the cashier at the hardware store read simply, "Not everyone supports Patricia." The security guard at the gated entrance gave me a subtle nod. Even a few HOA members, behind closed doors, quietly voiced their disapproval of how things were being handled. The illusion of Patricia's total control was cracking. Each day, I trained with Clyde, my dog, to respond to a series of audio cues. I designed a harness system with an auto hook feature that could attach to an ATV without being noticed. Every night, I refined the routine, timing, speed, distance, until it was flawless. Then came the engineering project. Near the pig pen, I carefully constructed what looked like a harmless muddy patch, just another consequence of recent rain. But in reality, it was a trap, one designed to temporarily disable an ATV without causing injury. I spent days perfecting the mixture: clay, water, and a special non-toxic polymer that created a surface with deceptive traction. Anything heavier than 300 pounds would sink just enough to get stuck. To the casual observer, it looked like nothing, just another wet patch on a dirt road. But for anyone trying to intrude with force or intimidation, it would become a very real obstacle. And as far as I was concerned, it was only the beginning. Wheelbarrows rolled by, each one carrying a different load as I carefully documented the ideal composition for my purposes. I had positioned hidden cameras at multiple angles, some tucked behind brush, others mounted high up, ensuring total coverage of what I hoped would become an illuminating encounter. The emotional strain was starting to eat away at me. One sleepless night, I found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling in the dark, drowning in doubt. What if we just sold the place and moved on? I whispered to Emma. She turned slowly toward me, her voice soft but resolute. "We could," she said, "but this isn't just about us anymore. It's about Dave's sister, about all those other families who were driven out by her. If Patricia wins again, where does it stop?" She was right, of course. This fight had grown far beyond our little homestead. It had become a stand against the unchecked abuse of power, against a system that bullied and pushed until good people gave up and left. That Saturday morning, I made sure Patricia's nosy little spy network saw exactly what I wanted them to see. Me, loading up my truck with camping gear, making it look like I was heading out for the weekend. But the truth was something else entirely. I had quietly set up in a small hunting blind with a clear view of the only access road into our property. Emma stationed herself elsewhere, phone in hand, ready to call the sheriff at the first sign of trouble. Every camera we had was rolling. Clyde, our donkey, waited patiently by the pig pen, seeming to understand that today he had an important role to play. "Showtime, everyone," I whispered into my walkie-talkie as I heard the distant but unmistakable sound of approaching ATVs breaking the morning silence. Just then, my phone buzzed. A message from Dave lit up the screen. "Danger. Patricia isn't alone. She brought Greg and a stranger. All three are armed." I swallowed hard and adjusted my binoculars, my pulse quickening as the mist parted to reveal the incoming convoy. Patricia led the group on her signature red ATV. Greg followed close behind on a green one, and trailing them was a third man, someone I now recognized. Brian Foster, from Pinnacle Development. All three were wearing visible sidearms and sleek holsters, an obvious attempt at intimidation. They halted right at my property line. Through the lenses, I watched Brian unfurl a set of architectural blueprints on the hood of his ATV. "This section here will be the 9th hole," he said, pointing directly at my vegetable garden. And the clubhouse? That'll go where that eyesore of a barn stands. Patricia gave a smug nod of approval while Greg seemed increasingly uneasy, his eyes scanning the trees nervously. It was obvious he was expecting someone, or something, to go wrong. They proceeded down the access road, Patricia shouting performatively about community standards loud enough for any hidden ears to hear. Then they reached the stretch I had prepared. Her ATV hit the thick mud and started to slow. Damn mud, she cursed, revving the engine. But instead of powering through, the wheels spun helplessly, sinking deeper into what looked like just another puddle, but was in fact a finely tuned blend I'd crafted to defeat even the most determined tire tread. As planned, all three of them dismounted to push. Brian joined Patricia and Greg at the rear of the vehicle. That was my cue. I activated a specific audio tone, barely perceptible to humans, but unmistakable to Clyde. Trained over weeks of patient work, he responded immediately. From his spot near the pig pen, he began moving through the tall grass, pulling behind him a camouflaged cable. As they strained to budge the ATV, I remotely triggered the hook system. A soft click echoed in my earpiece as the latch locked onto the ATV's rear cargo frame, just below their line of sight. The hook wasn't some off-the-shelf gadget. I had engineered it myself from a modified fishing gaff, complete with a spring-loaded latch that would only release under over 75 pounds of force, far more than any bump or tug would deliver. They never saw Clyde coming until it was too late. The look on their faces was priceless. Patricia frozen in disbelief, Greg stumbling backward, and Brian instinctively reaching for his sidearm, only to lose his footing and land hard in the mud. Clyde, calm and focused, kept pulling. The composite cable, military-grade with an 800-pound capacity, held firm as the ATV slid across the muck toward the pig pen. They chased after it in a flurry of limbs and mud, slipping and flailing like characters in a slapstick comedy sketch. And I filmed every second from 3 different angles, making sure not to miss a single, glorious moment of their downfall. The ATV came to rest right in the center of the pig pen, where my curious herd immediately gathered around the strange intruder. Wilbur, our 400-pound Hampshire pig, led the charge, snuffling loudly at the seat, while the smaller piglets clambered onto the front rack. The once pristine vehicle was now a filthy mess, coated in thick, sticky Texas mud and dotted with curious snouts. Patricia, furious and humiliated, drew her Glock and fired a shot into the air. The pigs scattered in every direction, squealing. That was my cue. I stepped out of the blind, camera in hand, walking calmly toward them. "Excuse me," I called out, keeping my tone even. "But could someone explain why you're trespassing on private property with firearms?" Patricia spun around, her face flushed with fury. "This is HOA property, Cooper. We have every right to inspect for violations." She waved the gun vaguely in my direction, no longer pointing it directly, but still enough to make Greg take a few cautious steps back. Brian, eyes locked on my camera, pulled on Patricia's arm. "We should leave. He's recording everything." But Patricia was too far gone. "When this development goes through," she hissed, "people like you will be priced out anyway. Why fight the inevitable? This community deserves better than backyard farmers with their filthy animals." And just like that, she said it, on camera, the line that sealed her fate. She connected the HOA's actions directly to the commercial development plan. No more rumors. No more speculation. Just a full confession, dripping with contempt. Behind her, the pigs had resumed their investigation of the trapped ATV. Wilbur was now seated comfortably beside the vehicle, while one piglet had somehow managed to wedge itself into the front cargo basket. Patricia's once impeccable designer outfit was now stained, her shoes making wet squishing sounds as she stumbled, trying to regain control of the situation. And I just kept recording. Weapon in hand, she finally seemed to grasp the gravity of what was happening. From her perspective, the situation had spiraled out of control. Her pristine reputation as a poised, polished professional and the self-appointed leader of the community was now being publicly dragged through the mud, literally, right in front of my camera. Greg, standing next to her, looked genuinely shaken. There was no more room for pretense. "Patricia, that's enough. We need to leave," he said, his voice taking on a sharpness that hadn't been there before. the voice of a man suddenly realizing he might be complicit in something illegal. Patricia, clearly rattled, finally began to regain some composure. She lowered the weapon, though her hand trembled slightly. "This isn't over, Cooper," she said through clenched teeth, her voice cold and venomous. "Get your disgusting animals away from my vehicle." I didn't flinch. "Actually, Patricia, your vehicle is in my pig pen," I said, calmly and firmly. "And since you came onto my property armed, without permission, I imagine the sheriff will have a few questions for you." At the mention of law enforcement, all three of them froze, their confidence visibly deflated. Without another word, they abandoned the ATV right where it was and began making the slow, humiliated walk back toward the main road. Patricia glanced over her shoulders several times, shooting daggers with her eyes, but said nothing more. As soon as they were out of sight, I pulled out my phone and sent the footage to Emma, to Emily, and to several backup email addresses we had set up in case something like this ever happened. It was only the beginning. I looked down at Clyde, my loyal and surprisingly strategic companion, and gave him a fond pat on the head. "Nice work, buddy," I murmured. Almost on cue, a sheriff's department vehicle appeared at the end of the access road. The cruiser kicked up a small trail of dust as it came to a stop, and out stepped Sheriff Collins, his face unreadable but clearly serious. "Mr. Cooper," he said, approaching me. "We received a report of gunfire out here, and I also received a very interesting email with a video attachment. You and I need to talk." 3 days later, the entire community of Willow Creek Estates was buzzing with tension. Every resident had received an urgent notice from the HOA, calling for an emergency meeting to address what they called violent actions against HOA officers. It was Patricia's desperate attempt to twist the story before our footage could spread any further, to gain control of the narrative before the truth fully unraveled in public view. What we didn't expect, however, was the sheer boldness of her performance. The community center was filled to capacity when we arrived. Patricia, Nancy, and Greg sat at a long table facing the crowd, looking calm and in control. Beside them was a sharp-looking man in a custom-tailored suit, James Williams, their attorney. And sitting in the front row, perfectly centered for maximum attention, was Mayor Robert Harris himself. I also noticed Samantha Williams, one of the HOA's most vocal enforcers of rules and a longtime ally of Patricia, sitting further back. Her expression was impossible to read. But what the crowd didn't know was that I had already met with Samantha privately. I had shown her the unedited footage, everything. Her reaction had taken me by surprise. At first, stunned silence. Then, a wave of indignation. "I support community standards," she had said to me, clearly shaken, not armed intimidation. "This isn't what I signed up for." Back in the community center, Patricia rose to speak, dressed once again in an immaculate designer pantsuit. It was almost surreal. There wasn't a trace of mud or chaos left on her, just the polished facade. "Fellow community members," she began, her tone solemn and practiced, "I've called this meeting to address a serious and growing threat to the security and harmony of our neighborhood. Mr. Cooper has engaged in increasingly aggressive behavior, including training animals to attack HOA officers and causing deliberate damage to HOA property." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd as she painted a completely false narrative, positioning herself as the victim of a bizarre, animal-led ambush during what she called a routine inspection. It was pure fiction, delivered with confidence. Her attorney then stood to bolster her claims, announcing the HOA's plan to pursue several lawsuits against me for damages, obstruction, and creating a public nuisance. The mayor followed with a short speech full of corporate buzzwords: community development, economic opportunity, modernization, all meant to justify the quiet deals they were making behind closed doors. I waited in silence, biding my time. But then, unexpectedly, Samantha stood up. "Patricia," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I have a question about this so-called inspection. Were you carrying a firearm onto private property during it?" The room went absolutely silent. Patricia hesitated. "As board members, we take security precautions when necessary," she replied carefully. "I don't recall any HOA bylaw that authorizes armed inspections," Samantha shot back. "In fact, I'm quite certain that brandishing a weapon on someone's private land isn't just against HOA policy, it's against the law." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Patricia's grip on the situation was slipping fast. This was my moment. I rose and calmly asked for permission to address the room. Despite Patricia's protests, the crowd wanted to hear me out. I walked to the front, connected my laptop to the projector, and pressed play. The footage spoke for itself. Multiple camera angles, audio clips, timestamps. It was all there. Patricia and her companions trespassing on our land with weapons, getting their ATVs stuck, discussing hidden development deals, and worst of all, Patricia firing her gun in frustration and openly admitting the real reason for their harassment. The crowd erupted. People gasped, some shouted. Several stood, pointing at Patricia and demanding answers. The footage continued, showing earlier trespasses and even vandalism to our chicken coop. Patricia, scrambling to regain control, tried to dismiss the footage. "It's edited. It's out of context," she cried. "Everything we've done was to protect property values." Attorney Williams quickly backed her, calling the footage inadmissible and unreliable, but it was too late. The damage was done. People began asking pointed questions. When did the HOA approve plans for a golf course? Why weren't homeowners informed about Pinnacle development? What else had been kept from them? Mayor Harris, looking rattled, tried to salvage the moment. "Perhaps the best resolution," he said, carefully measured, "would be for Mr. Cooper to sell his land to the HOA. At fair market value, of course." Patricia was ready with a document, an official purchase offer, but the figure on it was an insult, far below what the land was actually worth. And then, another voice broke the tension. "I think everyone here needs to know what's really going on," Greg Wilson said, surprising everyone, including Patricia. He pointed to a large map projected behind him. "This isn't just about Cooper's Ranch. It's about every single property in this zone. Pinnacle Development has plans to buy and redevelop all of it. That means at least 15 more families will eventually be pressured, just like this." Silence fell over the room. No one could ignore the truth anymore. And just like that, the tide began to turn. The room erupted with a wave of anxious voices, a ripple of fear sweeping through the crowd as realization dawned. This wasn't just about us. Their homes might be next. The meeting, once tense but orderly, quickly dissolved into a frenzy of shouting and questions. Patricia stood at the front, clearly overwhelmed, her attempts to restore control lost in the chaos. Community members surged forward, demanding answers, pressing her for details about the development plans she had so carefully kept under wraps. Emma and I stood off to the side, watching the very unity that once held the HOA together fracture right before our eyes. Longtime residents like Dave, who had remained neutral until now, boldly declared their support for us, their voices loud and unwavering. Samantha, once a firm ally of Patricia's, began organizing an impromptu group of concerned homeowners in a far corner of the room, rallying them around a sense of collective betrayal. As we prepared to leave, Patricia intercepted me, separating me from the crowd. Her expression was tight, her eyes narrow with fury. "You think you're so clever, Cooper," she hissed under her breath, her words sharp and venomous. "We have tools you can't even imagine. Within 48 hours, you'll either sign those sale papers or—" She let the thread hang, unfinished, her lips curling into a cold, calculated smile before she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving a chill in her wake. That night, back at the ranch, Emma and I received a notification that sent a jolt of alarm through both of us. Our bank had flagged our mortgage for review, citing potential increases to our interest rate and even the possibility of foreclosure. Emma's voice trembled as the pieces clicked into place. "She has someone at the bank," she whispered, her face pale with realization. "She really could make us lose everything." For the first time in this fight, I felt a genuine flutter of fear in my chest. Patricia wasn't just playing hardball. She was wielding power with precision and cruelty, and she had far more connections than we ever imagined. The next morning brought an unexpected knock on our door. Standing there was Howard Blackwell, Patricia's husband. A quiet, reserved man in his late 50s, Howard had always seemed like a background figure, overshadowed by his wife's domineering presence. But today, he looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as we invited him inside. "Patricia doesn't know I'm here," he said softly, refusing the coffee Emma offered. "But I can't keep standing by." What Howard revealed stunned us. For years, he'd been secretly documenting his wife's questionable dealings, a personal insurance policy, he said. His motivation came from deep personal pain. His sister had taken her own life after being caught in a devastating real estate scam, eerily similar to what Patricia was now orchestrating. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke. I've lived with the guilt of not protecting her. I won't make that mistake again. From the inside pocket of his coat, he produced a flash drive and handed it to me. On it were damning emails between Patricia, Mayor Harris, and executives from Pinnacle Development, laying out a methodical plan to force out homeowners they deemed undesirable, making room for the resort expansion. The drive also contained suspicious financial transactions, evidence of kickbacks to the mayor through a web of shell companies. Most shocking of all was clear proof that Patricia had pressured a former colleague, now a loan officer at our bank, to sabotage our mortgage, targeting us personally as part of the scheme. Later that day, we received a confidential call from a man named Marcus Johnson, an employee at the bank. He confirmed what Howard had shared. "What happened to your file isn't right," he said quietly, his tone cautious, as if he feared being overheard. "I'm risking my job by telling you this, but someone at the top pushed for a fast-track negative review on your account." Marcus had a personal stake in this. His family had lost their farm years ago to a similar HOA setup, and he was determined not to let it happen again. He provided us with copies of internal emails showing the irregularities and promised to stall any changes to our mortgage for as long as possible. Meanwhile, Emily, the local reporter, had been digging into the web of connections we'd uncovered. What she found was explosive. Mayor Harris secretly held shares in Pinnacle Development through an offshore shell company. "This isn't just about your property," she said, her eyes wide with excitement. "This is systemic corruption at the municipal level." As the evidence piled up, we were contacted by Derek Thompson, a representative from Pinnacle Development. He asked to meet at a quiet coffee shop outside town. Derek, unlike Patricia, was blunt and business-minded. "Look, we want the deal," he said, adjusting his expensive tie. "But we don't want a legal and PR disaster. Patricia told us she'd manage this cleanly, but that clearly isn't happening." He offered a significantly higher buyout for our land, hoping to settle things quietly. "We build resorts, Mr. Cooper. We don't point guns or manipulate mortgages." Emma and I returned home, knowing we had reached a defining crossroads. We could take the money and walk away financially unscathed, or we could stay and fight, not just for ourselves, but for every family at risk of falling victim to this machine. "This isn't just about us anymore," Emma said, echoing the thoughts that weighed on us both. "If we take the deal, they'll just find new targets." We chose to fight. With Dave's help, we quickly formed a coalition of concerned residents. Samantha, now fully on our side after learning the extent of Patricia's actions, joined us with fierce determination. Emily prepared a bombshell exposé for the paper. Howard agreed to testify publicly against his wife. Marcus secured records of the bank's unethical actions, while Sheriff Collins, armed with our growing mountain of evidence, began preparing potential criminal charges, particularly for the use of a firearm during an HOA dispute and the financial misconduct. Timing was critical. Patricia and the HOA had scheduled a groundbreaking ceremony for the new resort development in just 3 days, with media and local officials invited. We planned to unveil everything at that very event, to blow the lid off the corruption when the cameras were rolling and the public's eyes were on them. What we didn't expect was Patricia discovering Howard's betrayal. The night before the ceremony, Dave sent us a chilling message. "Danger. Patricia found out Howard helped you. She's heading to your ranch with Greg and Brian. I heard them say they're coming to erase everything. This time, it's not just threats." I looked out the window and saw headlights cutting through the darkness, approaching fast. "Emma," I said urgently, "it's time. Activate Plan B. Call Sheriff Collins." Now, I turned to Clyde, our old ranch dog, who seemed to sense the tension in the air. "One last performance, old friend," I whispered, bracing myself. Patricia, Greg, and Brian were coming, under cover of night, their vehicles creeping toward our home. But this time, we weren't just waiting. We were ready. Cutting through the silence of the night, they moved with clear purpose, approaching the house like shadows slipping through fog. Watching through our security cameras, it became instantly clear this wasn't a casual visit. They were armed, each carrying tools, gasoline cans, and an unsettling air of determination. Their mission? Simple, chilling, destroy whatever evidence we had, and maybe the property itself, all before the morning's light could expose the truth we were about to share. But I wasn't caught off guard. I had planned for this moment, half expecting it, preparing the property not just with defenses, but with a kind of poetic justice. As they drew closer to the house, I triggered our custom security system, not a blaring alarm or a silent call to the police, but something far more disorienting. A series of industrial-grade floodlights flared to life, instantly turning the yard into a blinding field of artificial daylight. The three intruders, Patricia, Greg, and Brian, were caught like deer in headlights, frozen, momentarily blinded, and unmistakably exposed. Patricia's face contorted with fury, rage etched deep across every line. Greg hesitated, visibly shaken, his confidence starting to crumble. Brian, who had maintained a cold professionalism up until now, began to show cracks in his armor. It was clear their plan was unraveling. And that's when Clyde made his entrance. Not a guard dog, not a drone, my donkey. Faithful, stubborn, and incredibly well-trained through weeks of work, Clyde triggered the next phase of our defense, a set of harmless but humiliating traps. First, the sprinklers activated, but not with ordinary water. They sprayed a mixture of non-toxic blue food coloring and water, impossible to clean off quickly. Patricia let out a furious scream as the liquid soaked her expensive clothes, her carefully curated look instantly ruined. Greg and Brian tried to scatter, but it was too late. They were drenched, humiliated, and very, very visible. Then came the music. Loudspeakers hidden around the property erupted in full-volume chaos, blasting songs no one could sleep through. The noise served a double purpose. It alerted the neighbors, and it added to the surreal absurdity of the scene. Patricia completely lost her composure. Covered in blue, screaming at the top of her lungs about property rights and personal vengeance, she pulled out a gun and fired blindly toward the barn. Her words were unhinged. "You people don't know your place." Greg, finally coming to his senses, backed away with his hands up. "This is insane, Patricia. I didn't sign up for this. This is a crime." Brian's face turned pale as he also began to step back. "I was just hired for security. I didn't know about burning evidence or destroying anything." His voice trembled, the weight of reality setting in. Right then, red and blue lights lit up the night as Sheriff Collins and Deputy Martinez arrived. They'd been nearby, waiting, ready, thanks to Emma's call. The sheriff's voice boomed from his vehicle's loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons. Hands where I can see them." Patricia, irrational and wild-eyed, ignored the command. She spun toward the sheriff's car, still holding her weapon and screaming about trespassing. Sheriff Collins didn't wait. He moved fast, tackling her to the ground, securing her as Deputy Martinez restrained Greg and Brian. The chaos was over in minutes. Brian immediately started talking, hoping to distance himself from Patricia's lunacy. "I swear, I didn't know she was going to bring guns. She told me this was just to scare them, not destroy anything." His voice was desperate, eager to cooperate. The scene quickly grew even more surreal as more people arrived. Emily showed up with a local news crew she'd had on standby. Howard, Patricia's husband, came to witness firsthand the full scope of her collapse. Derek Thompson from Pinnacle Development was alerted by the noise and chaos, arriving to make a statement of his own. Neighbors, roused by the music and shouting, began gathering at the edge of our property, staring in disbelief. As Patricia sat in the back of the patrol car, still dripping blue dye, Howard approached her, his voice calm but heavy with sorrow. "I couldn't let you destroy more lives. I couldn't save my sister, but I can stop this now." Her expression twisted from betrayal to fury. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You'll have nothing left when I'm done with you." But the tide had already turned. Derek Thompson publicly declared that Pinnacle was officially pulling out of the development deal. He made it clear to the cameras that his company upheld ethical standards and would not be associated with what had transpired. The unspoken implication that Patricia, and likely Mayor Harris, did not share those values was obvious to all watching. Greg, now completely rattled, offered to turn state's witness, revealing the financial connections between the HOA, the mayor, and Pinnacle. His statement would later become a cornerstone of the investigation. By morning, the story had exploded across local and regional news. Mayor Harris, clearly implicated, announced a temporary leave of absence pending the investigation, but the damage was done. Patricia, Greg, and Brian faced a long list of charges: criminal trespass, attempted property damage, conspiracy, and in Patricia's case, brandishing a firearm with intent to intimidate. The evidence, much of it provided by Howard, Marcus, and others in the community, was airtight. The emergency HOA meeting that followed shattered attendance records in Willow Creek's history. Residents, long frustrated, voted decisively to dissolve the entire board. In its place, they formed a new community council, transparent and inclusive, with Dave as the interim chair. Patricia's harsh and arbitrary rules were suspended, pending a full review by a committee made up of both longtime farming families and newer homeowners. Marcus, once quietly targeted by Patricia for standing in our corner, received a promotion at the bank after the management realized the pressure he'd been under. His supervisor, who had collaborated with the HOA's scheme to force us out, was placed on administrative leave while the bank issued a formal apology and restored our original mortgage terms. 1 year later, Willow Creek Estates had become a different place. Emma and I turned our ranch into a learning center where families came to discover sustainable living practices. Clyde became something of a local legend. School children came by to feed him carrots and hear how a donkey helped expose deep-rooted corruption. Dave and Samantha worked side by side with others to forge a balanced future, one that respected both tradition and progress. Howard, having finally found his own voice, filed for divorce and launched a nonprofit to support victims of abusive HOAs nationwide. He channeled his grief into purpose, determined to protect others from the devastation that had once torn through his family. Meanwhile, Patricia, Greg, and several former board members continued to face serious legal consequences. Mayor Harris, disgraced and exposed, resigned after evidence surfaced tying him financially to the Pinnacle deals. On the anniversary of that unforgettable night, Emma and I sat together on our porch, glasses raised, watching Clyde and the rest of the animals grazing in the soft golden light of sunset. I turned to her and said, half laughing, "Who would have thought our path to freedom would start with a gun, a donkey, and a pig pen?" She smiled warmly, her eyes full of peace. "Sometimes," she said, "you do what you must to protect your home." As the camera panned out, it passed over our dirt access road, now marked with a wooden sign that read, "Clyde's Way, used with donkey's permission." Nearby sat our old ATV, repainted and transformed into a children's reading nook at the Learning Center. A small plaque on the side read simply, "Gift from the HOA. We really do care about your experience." The irony wasn't lost on us, and neither was the triumph.